Night had already fallen over the Pacific, but the sea was anything but calm. The vast black expanse stretched endlessly beneath a sky choked with smoke and distant flashes of anti-aircraft fire. In the distance, the silhouette of an American carrier cut through the water like a floating fortress, its deck alive with movement. Sailors ran between aircraft. Signal lights flickered in coded bursts, and the low thunder of engines vibrated through steel hulls. War in the Pacific had become a brutal contest of range, speed, and endurance. And at the center of it all stood one aircraft that would redefine naval air power forever. But to understand how this machine rose to dominance, you have to rewind to a time when the United States Navy wasn't certain it even needed it. In the late 1930s, naval doctrine around the world still revolved around battleships. Massive floating guns were considered the ultimate symbols of power. Aircraft carriers were often treated as supporting assets, useful, but secondary. The idea that planes launched from a moving deck could decide the fate of fleets seemed ambitious, even reckless. Yet across the ocean, tensions were rising. Japan had been expanding aggressively throughout Asia, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had already begun refining long-range naval aviation tactics. Their pilots trained relentlessly for coordinated torpedo and dive-bombing strikes. Their carrier doctrine was evolving quickly. And while American planners debated budgets and strategy in Washington, the possibility of a Pacific conflict was becoming increasingly real. Inside the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, a handful of forward-thinking officers understood that range would be everything. The Pacific Ocean was vast beyond imagination. Any aircraft that hoped to be useful in that theater would need to fly farther than its predecessors, carry heavier payloads, and still survive in hostile skies. Existing carrier aircraft simply didn't have that endurance. They were effective for scouting and limited strike roles, but they couldn't project power deep into enemy territory. If the United States was going to fight across thousands of miles of open water, it would need something entirely different. Engineers began sketching designs for a long-range carrier-based bomber, an aircraft capable of striking enemy ships far beyond visual range of the fleet. It would need folding wings to fit in crowded hangar decks. It would need a reinforced landing gear to handle brutal carrier landings. And most importantly, it would need fuel capacity unlike anything that had ever taken off from a carrier before. The design that emerged was unconventional. Larger than most carrier planes. Heavy. Ambitious. Critics inside the Navy questioned whether such a large aircraft could even operate safely from a carrier deck. Some believed it would be too slow to defend itself. Others worried it would drain resources from fighter development. But the project moved forward. Test flights revealed both promise and problems. The aircraft had remarkable range, far exceeding expectations. It could stay in the air for hours, pushing farther across open ocean than any previous naval bomber. Yet its size made it vulnerable. Its defensive armament needed improvement. Its engines demanded constant refinement. Every test exposed new weaknesses, but also new potential. Then came December 7, 1941. When Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor, the debate ended overnight. Battleships burned in the harbor, and the illusion of their invincibility died with them. Aircraft carriers, ironically absent from the harbor that morning, suddenly became the centerpiece of American naval strategy. The United States found itself in a desperate race. It needed to strike back. It needed range. It needed an aircraft capable of reaching across vast stretches of ocean and hitting the enemy where they least expected it. The long-range carrier bomber project, once controversial, was now urgent. Production accelerated. Factories shifted to wartime footing. Engineers worked around the clock refining structural weaknesses, reinforcing wings, upgrading defensive guns, and improving engine reliability. Every improvement was driven by a single reality. American carriers would soon sail into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. By early 1942, the aircraft was entering operational service. The crews trained intensively, learning to manage its weight during carrier takeoffs. Launching a heavy bomber from a pitching deck required precision. Too little wind over the deck, and the plane might plunge into the sea. Too much throttle too quickly, and engines could fail under stress. Pilots learned to trust the machine. Navigators mastered long-distance over-water navigation using little more than dead reckoning and celestial fixes. Radiomen stayed alert for enemy signals. Gunners drilled relentlessly, preparing for the inevitable fighter interceptions that would come once the aircraft reached its target. The first real test would come sooner than anyone expected. In April 1942, a bold plan emerged, one that would shock the world. While medium bombers were prepared for a daring strike against the Japanese home islands, carrier-based aviation units trained for simultaneous operations across the Pacific. The long-range bomber's ability to scout vast areas became invaluable. It could locate enemy fleets before they located American carriers. And in the Pacific, detection meant survival. Weeks later, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the importance of carrier aviation became undeniable. For the first time in history, opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other directly. Aircraft carried the battle entirely. Long-range scouting missions played a decisive role in locating Japanese forces. Though losses were heavy on both sides, the battle halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Then came Midway. By June 1942, American codebreakers had uncovered Japan's plan to lure U.S. carriers into a trap. The stage was set for one of the most pivotal naval battles in history. Carrier decks were crowded with fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and the long-range aircraft that would help search the endless horizon. Before dawn, pilots climbed into cockpits under dim red deck lights. Engines roared to life. One by one, aircraft rolled forward, catapulted into gray morning skies. The ocean below was deceptively calm. Hours passed. Fuel gauges slowly ticked downward. Then, at last, a sighting report crackled over the radio. Enemy carriers located. What followed would change the course of the war. American dive bombers struck first, catching Japanese carriers with decks loaded and vulnerable. Flames erupted. Explosions tore through hangars. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were fatally damaged. A 4th would fall later that day. While other aircraft delivered the decisive blows, the importance of long-range scouting and coordination could not be overstated. Without early detection, American carriers might have been caught unprepared, just as they had been at Pearl Harbor. The battle ended with a stunning American victory. 4 Japanese carriers were lost, along with hundreds of experienced pilots. It was a strategic turning point. From that moment forward, Japan would struggle to regain the initiative. And the long-range carrier bomber proved its worth beyond doubt. As the war stretched into 1943 and 1944, the Pacific Campaign expanded across island chains: Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each new offensive required aircraft capable of striking distant targets, patrolling sea lanes, and supporting amphibious landings. The bomber evolved alongside the conflict. Upgraded variants featured improved radar for anti-submarine patrols. Stronger defensive armament increased survivability. Crews grew more experienced, learning how to manage long overwater missions where mechanical failure meant certain death. By the time American forces pushed toward the Philippines, carrier aviation had matured into a devastating instrument of power. Massive carrier task forces roamed the Pacific like mobile air bases, launching coordinated strikes that overwhelmed Japanese defenses. And through it all, the long-range bomber continued flying, scouting, striking, enduring. Yet its story was never just about specifications or combat records. It represented a shift in naval philosophy, a recognition that air power, not armor plating, would dominate the seas. It proved that carriers, once considered experimental, were now the true capital ships of modern warfare. The ocean at night still looked the same, dark, endless, indifferent. But above it, history had changed. The aircraft that once faced skepticism had become a cornerstone of victory. And its journey was far from over. The victory at Midway did not end the war in the Pacific. It simply shifted its momentum. In the months that followed, American carriers began pushing westward, island by island, reef by reef, through a chain of battlegrounds scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. Each new operation demanded more from the men aboard the carriers, and from the long-range aircraft that had proven its value in the crucible of Midway. The Pacific was not a forgiving theater. There were no front lines carved into soil, no trenches to hold. The battlefield was fluid, constantly shifting with tides, weather and intelligence reports. Carriers became roaming fortresses, moving under radio silence, striking suddenly, then disappearing over the horizon before the enemy could respond. And in this new style of warfare, distance was everything. The long-range carrier bomber was no longer just a scout. It became the fleet's extended eyes and, increasingly, its heavy fist. As operations intensified around Guadalcanal in late 1942, the aircraft found itself flying some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Guadalcanal was chaos. Japanese and American forces clashed repeatedly in what became a brutal war of attrition. Supply lines were stretched thin. Night surface battles erupted in confined waters. Airfields changed hands. Every sunrise threatened a new air raid. For carrier crews, the tempo was relentless. Before dawn, pilots gathered for briefings under dim red lights below deck. Maps were unrolled. Intelligence officers pointed to suspected enemy positions. Weather reports were short and often unreliable. Once airborne, there would be no second chances. The long-range bomber's endurance became its greatest asset. It could remain aloft for extended patrols, searching for Japanese convoys attempting to reinforce the island under cover of darkness. These Tokyo Express runs were fast and evasive, and locating them required persistence. Many missions ended without contact. Crews would stare at endless water for hours, scanning the horizon through binoculars until their eyes burned. Navigation over open ocean required extraordinary precision. A small error in heading could mean missing the carrier by dozens of miles on the return leg. Fuel margins were calculated down to the last gallon. Mechanical reliability improved steadily, but engines still had a way of reminding crews that war was unforgiving. A sputter, a vibration, a sudden drop in oil pressure, any of these could turn a routine patrol into a fight for survival. Ditching in the Pacific was a terrifying prospect. Even if the aircraft survived the water landing, rescue was never guaranteed. The ocean was vast. Sharks were common. Sun exposure alone could kill within days. Yet despite the risks, the aircraft kept flying. As 1943 progressed, the United States began shifting from defensive operations to coordinated offensives. The strategy, known as island hopping, aimed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and instead seize strategically valuable islands that could serve as airfields and naval bases. Carrier aviation played a crucial role in softening these targets before amphibious landings. The long-range bomber was increasingly used in strike roles against shipping, airfields, and coastal installations. With improved ordnance capacity, it could carry heavier bomb loads or specialized munitions designed to penetrate hardened structures. But flying a large aircraft into contested airspace was never simple. Japanese fighters remained dangerous opponents. Though American fighter development was accelerating, escort coverage was not always available for deep-range missions. Defensive gunners aboard the bomber had to remain vigilant, scanning for the glint of sunlight on approaching aircraft. Combat reports described sudden attacks emerging from cloud cover or out of the sun. Tracer fire would arc past the cockpit. The aircraft's size made it less agile than dedicated attack planes, so survival depended on tight formation flying and disciplined defensive fire. Losses mounted, but so did experience. By late 1943, radar technology began transforming naval warfare. New variants of the bomber incorporated early airborne radar systems, allowing crews to detect ships or submarines beyond visual range. Night operations became more feasible. Anti-submarine patrols extended the protective umbrella around carrier groups. The aircraft was adapting to a changing war. Then came 1944, a year of enormous scale. American industrial power was now fully mobilized. Carrier task forces grew in size and complexity. Instead of 2 or 3 carriers operating together, entire fleets of fast carriers began launching coordinated strikes numbering in the hundreds of aircraft. Operations in the Marshall Islands and the Marianas demonstrated just how far naval aviation had come. Massive pre-invasion bombardments were preceded by waves of carrier aircraft targeting runways, fuel depots, and defensive positions. The long-range bomber's role expanded again. It conducted deep reconnaissance ahead of the fleet, mapping enemy air defenses and identifying shipping movements. It participated in coordinated strikes designed to cripple Japanese air power before landings began. The scale of these operations was staggering. Flight decks were choreographed with precision. Aircraft were spotted nose to tail. Ordnance crews worked rapidly, loading bombs and torpedoes while fuel hoses snaked across steel decks. Pilots climbed aboard, adjusted harnesses, and waited for the signal. Launch windows were tight. Timing was everything. Once airborne, formations assembled and headed west, often flying for hours before reaching their targets. Radio silence was maintained whenever possible. Each crew understood that surprise increased survival. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted in June 1944, carrier aviation reached a new peak. Known later as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the battle saw Japanese carrier air groups decimated by improved American tactics, radar coordination, and fighter performance. But the long-range bomber still played its part. Its reconnaissance missions helped locate elements of the Japanese fleet. Its strike capability extended the reach of American carriers. And as Japanese air resistance collapsed, the aircraft increasingly operated with relative dominance over contested waters. Yet, even dominance carried risk. As American forces advanced toward the Philippines, Japanese strategy shifted dramatically. Conventional naval engagements were becoming untenable. In response, Japan turned to a desperate tactic that would shock Allied forces: organized suicide attacks. The first large-scale kamikaze assaults began in late 1944. Carrier decks that had once seemed untouchable now faced aircraft deliberately crashing into them at full speed. Defensive gunners across the fleet fired relentlessly, but the psychological impact was immense. Every radar contact triggered tension. Every approaching aircraft carried the possibility of catastrophe. The long-range bomber, often airborne on patrol, sometimes witnessed these attacks from above, columns of smoke rising from damaged ships, rescue vessels scrambling to recover survivors. The Pacific War was entering its most brutal phase. By 1945, American carriers operated within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Missions grew longer, more ambitious. Airfields, factories, and shipping lanes were targeted systematically. The bomber's endurance remained invaluable. It could escort strike packages partway to their targets, conduct independent reconnaissance, or search for enemy fleet movements attempting last-ditch operations. One of the most dramatic examples came during the lead-up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. As intelligence reports filtered in about Japanese naval movements, carrier aircraft were dispatched to verify sightings. The vast engagement that followed became the largest naval battle in history. Throughout these operations, the long-range bomber continued to serve quietly but consistently, never as glamorous as dive bombers delivering pinpoint strikes, never as celebrated as fighters engaging in dogfights, yet absolutely essential to the orchestration of carrier warfare. By the final months of the war, the aircraft had evolved far beyond its early controversial beginnings. Structural reinforcements improved survivability. Radar capabilities expanded mission flexibility. Crew training had reached a professional standard unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. But war is never static. As newer aircraft designs entered service, faster, more specialized, more heavily armed, the long-range bomber began to show its age. Aviation technology was advancing at breathtaking speed. Jet propulsion loomed on the horizon. Even as it continued flying combat missions, planners were already envisioning its eventual replacement. Still, when the war finally drew to a close in August 1945, the aircraft had carved its place in history. From the uncertain debates of the late 1930s to the carrier battles that reshaped naval warfare, it had been present at nearly every turning point. It had helped transform the aircraft carrier from a supporting vessel into the dominant capital ship of the modern era. The Pacific Ocean, once a seemingly insurmountable barrier, had become a highway for air power. And yet, Even as victory celebrations erupted across carrier decks, a quiet question lingered. What would become of the aircraft that helped make it possible? Because peace brings change as surely as war does. And the next chapter of its story would unfold not in combat, but in legacy. The transformation was gradual at first, almost subtle. After the stunning victory at Midway, the United States Navy did not suddenly declare that one aircraft had won the war. Instead, the Pacific Campaign became a grinding, relentless advance across thousands of miles of ocean. Yet with every new operation, one pattern kept repeating itself. Before ships moved, before Marines landed, before bombs fell, long-range carrier aircraft were already in the sky. By late 1942, the brutal fighting around Guadalcanal had exposed just how unforgiving the Pacific theater could be. The island itself was a steaming, disease-ridden battleground where jungle and coral claimed as many lives as bullets. But the surrounding waters were even more dangerous. Carrier groups operated under constant threat from submarines, long-range land-based bombers, and enemy task forces that could emerge from the horizon with terrifying speed. In this environment, the long-range carrier bomber became more than a strike aircraft. It became the fleet's eyes. Dawn patrols were among the most tense missions of the war. Crews would assemble on the carrier deck before sunrise, the air thick with humidity and the smell of aviation fuel. Engines coughed to life one by one, propellers slicing through the dim light as deck crews gave final hand signals. Each aircraft carried extra fuel tanks, often sacrificing bomb load for endurance. The mission was simple in theory, search. But in practice, it meant flying for hours over empty ocean, scanning the endless blue for a single wake line or distant speck of smoke. Navigation was a science balanced on intuition. GPS did not exist. Radar was still developing. Crews relied on dead reckoning, wind drift calculations, stopwatch timing, and celestial navigation when skies allowed. A miscalculation of just a few degrees could mean missing the carrier group entirely on the return flight. And fuel margins were thin. Many pilots later described staring at fuel gauges that seemed to drop faster with every glance. Yet these patrols saved fleets. During the long months of attritional fighting in the Solomon Islands, Japanese naval forces attempted repeated nighttime reinforcement runs, the so-called Tokyo Express. American surface ships fought desperate engagements in the dark, but daylight belonged increasingly to carrier aviation. Long-range bombers extended the search grid outward, giving commanders critical early warning. Even when they did not drop bombs, their reports shaped strategy. By 1943, production improvements and combat experience had refined the aircraft considerably. Reinforced armor protected crew positions. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. Improved defensive gun turrets gave gunners better fields of fire against attacking fighters. The aircraft was still not fast by fighter standards, but it no longer entered combat defenseless. Perhaps the most significant evolution came with radar. As the war progressed, variants of the bomber were equipped with increasingly sophisticated airborne radar sets. Bulky by modern standards and sometimes temperamental in tropical humidity, these early systems nonetheless transformed maritime patrol operations. Crews could now detect ships and even submarines at night or through cloud cover, something unimaginable just a few years earlier. Anti-submarine warfare became a critical mission set. Japanese submarines had proven capable of devastating strikes against American carriers and transports. The sinking of the carrier USS Wasp and heavy damage to others underscored the threat. Long-range aircraft began flying hunter-killer patrols, coordinating with destroyers below. Radar contacts would prompt low-altitude passes, depth charges dropping into swirling water. While not every patrol resulted in a confirmed kill, the constant aerial presence forced enemy submarines to remain submerged, limiting their effectiveness. Meanwhile, the strategic map of the Pacific continued to change. American forces adopted an island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions while capturing key islands that could support airfields and naval bases. Each leap forward extended the range of operations. Carriers became mobile spearheads, projecting power far beyond fixed land bases. In late 1943, as operations moved into the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, carrier task forces began operating at a scale previously unseen. Multiple carriers sailed together, forming powerful task groups that could launch hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves. Fighters swept ahead to clear enemy resistance. Dive bombers targeted airfields and shipping. Torpedo planes struck at larger vessels. And long-range bombers scouted ahead, mapping enemy positions and identifying threats. The coordination required was extraordinary. Radio discipline had to be maintained to prevent confusion. Launch and recovery cycles became intricate ballets of timing and fuel management. A delayed recovery could leave aircraft circling with nearly empty tanks. Bad weather could scatter formations across hundreds of miles. Yet the system worked, and it grew more efficient with each operation. By mid-1944, the war reached another climactic moment, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Often referred to as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, this engagement marked the near destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. In the weeks leading up to the battle, American carriers operated aggressively around the Mariana Islands, supporting landings on Saipan. Japanese forces, determined to defend what they considered a vital defensive perimeter, assembled a powerful fleet. Their plan relied on long-range air strikes launched from carriers and land bases. But once again, detection proved decisive. American long-range patrol aircraft fanned out across enormous search sectors. Radar-assisted scouting provided earlier and more accurate contact reports than ever before. When Japanese strike groups launched, they faced not a surprise fleet, but a fully alerted defense. Fighter direction officers aboard American carriers used radar data to vector intercepting fighters with remarkable precision. Waves of Japanese aircraft were engaged far from the fleet. Many never even saw their targets. Others broke through only to face concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The result was catastrophic for Japan. Hundreds of experienced pilots were lost in a single campaign. Carrier decks that once symbolized imperial expansion were left nearly empty of trained aircrews. While American aircraft losses were not insignificant, the imbalance in training and industrial capacity had become overwhelming. Throughout the battle, long-range bombers continued their dual role, scouting ahead and striking when opportunities emerged. Late in the engagement, American aircraft executed one of the longest carrier-based strikes of the war, pursuing retreating Japanese ships at extreme range. It was a risky decision. Many aircraft would have to recover after dark, something rarely practiced and inherently dangerous. As dusk fell, returning pilots faced one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of their lives. Carrier decks were blacked out to avoid enemy detection. Landing lights flickered on only at the last moment. Some aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. Destroyers raced to rescue survivors. Yet the strike had succeeded, further crippling Japan's naval power. By this stage of the war, the long-range carrier bomber had fully matured into a strategic asset. It was no longer controversial. It was indispensable. The advance continued toward the Philippines in late 1944, culminating in the enormous Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. This sprawling series of engagements involved multiple fleets operating across hundreds of miles. Confusion, courage, and near-disaster intertwined in dramatic fashion. Scouting reports from long-range aircraft once again shaped outcomes. When elements of the Japanese fleet attempted to lure American carriers away with decoy forces, accurate reconnaissance allowed commanders to piece together enemy intentions. Although fierce fighting erupted, particularly off Samar, where lightly armed escort carriers and destroyers faced overwhelming battleships, air power repeatedly intervened to disrupt Japanese advances. By now, American carrier doctrine emphasized relentless pressure. Aircraft were launched at dawn and recovered at dusk, day after day. Maintenance crews worked through tropical heat and monsoon rains to keep engines running. Replacement aircraft flowed steadily from American factories. New pilots arrived with improved training pipelines that emphasized carrier landings, navigation, and gunnery. The psychological shift was profound. Early in the war, American forces had fought with caution, mindful of limited resources. By late 1944, The industrial might of the United States had tilted the balance decisively. Carrier groups operated with confidence born not of arrogance, but of hard-earned experience and overwhelming logistical support. As 1945 approached, the war moved ever closer to Japan itself. Carrier aircraft conducted strikes against the home islands, targeting airfields, shipping, and industrial facilities. The distances involved were immense. Long-range capability, once considered excessive, now proved essential. Kamikaze attacks introduced a new and terrifying threat. Japanese pilots, flying suicide missions, aimed directly at American ships. Defensive gunners aboard bombers and fighters alike found themselves engaging aircraft that showed no intention of breaking off. Early detection became even more critical. The farther from the fleet attackers could be intercepted, the better. Long-range patrol aircraft helped extend the defensive perimeter outward, buying precious minutes for interceptors to respond. Radar operators scanned for faint returns that might signal inbound attackers. In this final phase of the war, every second mattered. When the conflict finally ended in August 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's subsequent surrender, carrier aviation stood transformed from experimental doctrine to dominant reality. The aircraft that had once struggled for acceptance had played a quiet but vital role in nearly every major Pacific engagement. Its legacy extended beyond the war itself. Post-war naval planners studied the lessons learned across the Pacific. The concept of power projection from mobile sea-based airfields would define Cold War strategy. Carrier groups became instruments not just of war, but of deterrence. The integration of radar, long-range patrol capability, and coordinated strike packages laid the foundation for modern naval aviation. Technology would evolve. Jet engines would replace piston props. Guided missiles would supplement bombs and torpedoes. Nuclear propulsion would free carriers from reliance on conventional fuel. But the fundamental principles, range, detection, coordination, remained rooted in the hard lessons of World War II. The ocean, vast and indifferent, still stretches as it did in 1942. But the way nations command it has changed forever. From the tense dawn patrols over Guadalcanal to the sweeping strikes of the Philippine Sea, the long-range carrier bomber proved that distance could be conquered, that fleets could see beyond the horizon, and that air power, launched from steel decks in the middle of open water, would shape the fate of empires. And though newer aircraft would eventually take its place, its role in redefining naval warfare ensured that it would never simply fade into history. By the time the guns fell silent in August 1945, the long-range carrier bomber had done more than fight a war. It had helped rewrite the logic of naval power. But history rarely stops when peace is declared. Instead, it shifts, recalibrates, and tests the relevance of what came before. For the aircraft that had proven itself across the Pacific, the post-war world would present a different kind of challenge: survival in an era of jets, missiles, and atomic weapons. The immediate aftermath of World War II was paradoxical. On one hand, the United States Navy stood at the height of its power. Its carrier fleets had crossed the Pacific, dismantled an empire, and demonstrated that aircraft carriers were no longer experimental. They were central. On the other hand, budgets were shrinking. Demobilization was rapid. The public wanted peace, not permanent mobilization. Hundreds of ships were decommissioned. Thousands of aircraft were placed into storage or scrapped. Yet naval aviation did not disappear. It adapted. Strategists in Washington studied the lessons of Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf with intense scrutiny. One conclusion stood out above all: detection and reach determined survival. If you could see the enemy first and strike first, you controlled the engagement. The long-range carrier bomber had embodied that principle. Its endurance, its scouting ability, and later its radar integration had given fleets precious hours, sometimes minutes, that meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. As the Cold War began to take shape, the geopolitical focus shifted from the Pacific Islands to a global standoff between superpowers. The Soviet Union emerged as a rival with its own growing navy and submarine force. Nuclear weapons changed strategic calculations overnight. Suddenly, Aircraft carriers were not just tools for regional campaigns. They were floating platforms capable of delivering atomic ordnance. In this new environment, the Navy examined whether piston-engine bombers still had a place. Jet technology was advancing rapidly. Aircraft like the early carrier-based jets promised greater speed and altitude performance. But jets also consumed fuel at staggering rates. Range, once again, remained a central concern. The long-range carrier bomber, despite its World War II origins, retained one powerful advantage: endurance. It could stay aloft for hours, loiter over search areas, and operate far from land bases. In the late 1940s, as anti-submarine warfare grew in importance, that endurance became invaluable once more. The Soviet submarine fleet expanded quickly, posing a potential threat to Atlantic shipping lanes and carrier task forces. American planners remembered how disruptive Japanese submarines had been during the Pacific War. They were determined not to repeat the experience. Carrier aviation would again serve as the fleet's protective shield. Variants of the long-range bomber were modified extensively for anti-submarine missions. Improved radar systems, magnetic anomaly detectors, and sonobuoy deployment capabilities were integrated. Crews trained to identify periscope wakes, subtle surface disturbances, and radar contacts in rough seas. Patrol patterns were refined into carefully calculated grids designed to maximize coverage. Operations shifted from the tropical Pacific to colder waters of the Atlantic and beyond. Carrier groups conducted exercises simulating convoy protection and submarine hunts. The aircraft that had once searched for Japanese carriers now searched for diesel-electric submarines slipping silently beneath gray waves. But technological change was relentless. By the early 1950s, newer aircraft designs began to eclipse the aging bomber in performance. Dedicated anti-submarine platforms were developed with more advanced sensors and specialized crew compartments. Jet aircraft increasingly dominated strike roles. Carrier decks themselves were evolving. Angled flight decks, steam catapults, and stronger arresting gear allowed for heavier and faster planes. Still, the legacy aircraft continued to serve in secondary roles: training, patrol, and reserve units. Many were transferred to allied nations under military assistance programs. In foreign service, they extended their operational lives, flying maritime patrol missions, coastal defense sorties, and training exercises far from their original Pacific battlegrounds. The cultural memory of the aircraft remained strong within the Navy. Veterans who had flown it at Midway or over the Marianas often spoke of its reliability and forgiving flight characteristics. It was not glamorous. It was not sleek, but it had brought crews home across thousands of empty miles. In aviation, that counted for everything. By the mid-1950s, however, retirement became inevitable. Airframes designed in the late 1930s could only be pushed so far. Metal fatigue accumulated. Maintenance demands increased. Spare parts grew scarce as production lines shifted to newer designs. Gradually, squadrons transitioned away from the venerable bomber. Many aircraft were dismantled. Some were sunk as target practice during weapons testing. A few were preserved for museums, their wings folded as if still waiting for deck crews to guide them into place. Visitors walking beneath their broad frames decades later would see riveted aluminum and glass turrets, but perhaps not immediately grasp the oceans those machines had crossed. Yet the true legacy of the aircraft was not confined to surviving airframes. It lived on in doctrine. Modern carrier strike groups, whether operating in the Mediterranean, the South China Sea, or the Persian Gulf, still rely on layered detection and long-range surveillance. Airborne early warning aircraft extend radar horizons. Maritime patrol planes sweep sea lanes. Strike fighters carry precision weapons hundreds of miles from the carrier deck. The principle is the same as it was in 1942: see first, strike first, survive. Even unmanned systems, drones capable of remaining airborne for extended durations, echo the endurance philosophy pioneered by long-range carrier bombers of World War II. Technology has changed dramatically, but the operational concept remains deeply rooted in those early experiments with range and scouting. Historians often focus on more famous aircraft of the Pacific War, nimble fighters that dueled in the sky, dive bombers that delivered decisive blows at midway, torpedo planes that braved intense anti-aircraft fire. The long-range bomber's contributions were sometimes quieter, less cinematic. It did not always appear in dramatic gun camera footage. Its victories were measured in sighting reports, in hours of patrol, in enemy forces detected before they could strike. But without those hours, many of the war's most celebrated successes might never have occurred. The aircraft also represented something deeper about industrial capacity and adaptability. When it was first proposed, skeptics doubted whether such a large, heavy plane could operate from a carrier. Its development required risk, engineering risk, budgetary risk, doctrinal risk. Yet the Navy's willingness to experiment paid dividends when war erupted. That lesson echoed into the Cold War and beyond. Innovation in peacetime, even when controversial, could determine survival in wartime. In the decades following its retirement, reunions of veterans kept its memory alive. Pilots and gunners shared stories of long patrols over empty seas, of storm systems that battered their aircraft, of tense carrier landings in darkness. They spoke of friendships forged in cramped cockpits and of the quiet pride that came from knowing they had played a part in something larger than themselves. Museums eventually displayed restored examples with informational plaques detailing specifications, wingspan, maximum range, crew complement, armament. But numbers alone could not capture the feeling of standing on a carrier deck at dawn, engines roaring, knowing that beyond the horizon lay uncertainty. Today, when visitors stand beneath one of the surviving aircraft in places like the National Naval Aviation Museum, they often marvel at its size relative to other World War II planes. Its broad wings hint at endurance. Its defensive gun positions suggest vulnerability as much as strength. Children look up at the folded wings and ask how such a machine could launch from a moving ship. The answer lies not only in engineering, but in determination. Carrier crews learned to coax heavy aircraft into the air with careful wind positioning and precise throttle control. Pilots mastered approaches that left little margin for error. Maintenance crews improvised repairs in tropical conditions using whatever materials were available. It was a collective achievement. As the 21st century advances, naval warfare continues to evolve. Hypersonic missiles, cyber operations, and satellite reconnaissance shape modern strategy. Yet aircraft carriers remain central to many navies' power projection capabilities. Their air wings are more advanced, more lethal, more technologically sophisticated than anything imagined in 1942. And still, the lineage traces back. The long-range carrier bomber proved that endurance and reconnaissance were not secondary missions. They were foundational. It demonstrated that large aircraft could operate effectively from carriers if doctrine and design aligned. It showed that the ocean, vast as it was, could be systematically searched and contested. In many ways, its story is not about a single model designation or production figure. It is about the moment naval warfare crossed a threshold. When steel battleships ceded dominance to mobile airfields. When range became as decisive as firepower. When information, gathered by aircraft flying lonely arcs over empty water, became the currency of survival. The war that forged it is now more than 8 decades in the past. The sailors and aviators who trusted it with their lives are fading into history. But the principles it embodied remain active every time a carrier strike group deploys beyond its home port. The ocean at night is still dark and indifferent. Radar screens still glow in dim compartments. Aircraft still launch into uncertainty before dawn. Somewhere in that continuity lives the legacy of the long-range carrier bomber, a machine once doubted, later indispensable, and ultimately transformative. Its engines may no longer echo across carrier decks, but its impact continues to shape the way nations command the seas. Every story about war eventually arrives at a quiet place. Not a battlefield. Not a carrier deck alive with motion. Not the violent flash of anti-aircraft fire over black water. But a hangar. A museum floor. A patch of polished concrete beneath an aircraft that no longer flies. By the time the long-range carrier bomber had fully passed from operational service, the world it helped shape was already transforming again. Jet engines screamed across carrier decks. Radar grew smaller and infinitely more powerful. Nuclear submarines slipped beneath the waves with endurance that made even the longest World War II patrols seem modest. The pace of change accelerated so quickly that the piston-driven aircraft of the 1940s began to look ancient within a single generation. And yet, despite its obsolescence, the aircraft refused to vanish from memory. Its final chapter was not written in combat reports, but in preservation, scholarship, and reflection. In the 1960s and 1970s, as World War II receded into history and public attention shifted toward newer conflicts, veterans organizations began pushing to preserve representative aircraft from the Pacific War. Many had watched too many machines scrapped, cut apart by torches, melted down, or left to corrode in forgotten storage yards. They understood something important. Once the metal was gone, so too would be a tangible link to the experience. Restoration teams, often composed of volunteers, tracked down surviving airframes. Some were discovered in remote storage depots. Others were found in foreign service, retired but intact. A few were salvaged from unlikely locations, training fields, reserve bases, even derelict corners of air stations where they had sat for years. Bringing one back to display condition was not simple. Corrosion had eaten into control surfaces. Wiring harnesses were brittle. Fabric coverings required complete replacement. Instruments had to be sourced or recreated. Paint schemes demanded historical accuracy down to squadron markings and weathering patterns. But the work went forward. At institutions like the National Naval Aviation Museum, restoration became an act of storytelling. Curators didn't merely polish aluminum, they researched squadron histories, crew rosters, deployment records. They reconstructed not just an aircraft, but a context. Visitors walking through those halls today see more than rivets and propellers. They see placards describing early Pacific patrols, diagrams explaining radar evolution, photographs of deck crews guiding heavy aircraft into position beneath tropical skies. They see images from Guadalcanal and the vast sweep of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where long-range scouting helped blunt a desperate counteroffensive. For many veterans, returning to stand beneath the aircraft decades later was an emotional experience. The cockpit that once felt cramped and alive with radio chatter now sat silent. The dorsal gun position where a gunner once scanned the horizon for enemy fighters was frozen in place. The folding wings, once hydraulically lowered to fit into crowded hangars, now remained permanently extended for display. They would often point at specific details invisible to casual observers. That panel, one might say, was always rattling at high altitude. Or, we used to stow emergency rations right behind that bulkhead. Their memories transformed static exhibits into living artifacts. But the aircraft's final chapter extends beyond nostalgia. It continues to shape how naval historians interpret the evolution of maritime warfare. For decades after World War II, popular narratives often emphasized dramatic strike moments, the dive bombers over Midway, the torpedo runs at low altitude, the explosive headlines. Yet as scholarship deepened, analysts began highlighting the systemic importance of reconnaissance and endurance. In war colleges and academic conferences, case studies returned repeatedly to one conclusion: information dominance determined operational tempo. The long-range carrier bomber had provided that dominance at critical junctures. At Midway, early sighting reports allowed American commanders to position their carriers advantageously. During the Marianas Campaign, radar-assisted patrols extended defensive perimeters. In anti-submarine roles, persistent aerial presence suppressed threats before they could strike. The aircraft had embodied a principle that modern militaries now describe in technical terms: ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Today's ISR platforms may be satellites, high-altitude drones, or networked sensor arrays. But conceptually, they perform the same task once carried out by a crew of aviators scanning the ocean through binoculars while monitoring a primitive radar scope. The continuity is striking. Modern carrier strike groups deploy airborne early warning aircraft equipped with rotating radar domes. Long-range maritime patrol aircraft carry advanced sonobuoys and magnetic detectors. Unmanned systems loiter for hours or days over contested regions. The idea that control of the sea depends on persistent aerial awareness traces directly back to the Pacific campaigns of the 1940s. Even the risks remain familiar. Long-endurance missions still strain crews. Fuel margins still matter. Weather still complicates navigation. And in any conflict involving near-peer adversaries, the side that loses situational awareness risks catastrophic surprise. Thus, the legacy of the long-range carrier bomber is not merely historical, it is doctrinal. Its influence also extends into engineering philosophy. When designers today propose new carrier-based aircraft, they must balance size, range, payload, and deck compatibility, precisely the debates that surrounded the bomber's early development. Can a large airframe operate safely from a moving ship? How much range is enough? Does added endurance justify added weight? Those questions were once controversial. They are now standard components of naval aviation planning. As the Cold War gave way to the post-Cold War era, and then to the complex multipolar environment of the 21st century, carriers remained symbols of national reach. Whether responding to crises, deterring aggression, or projecting humanitarian aid, they serve as mobile airfields capable of appearing off distant coastlines without reliance on foreign bases. And every time an aircraft launches before dawn to extend the fleet's horizon, it echoes the patrols flown across the Pacific generations ago. There is something else, too, something less technical but equally important. The aircraft represented trust. Trust between pilot and navigator. Trust between gunner and radioman. Trust between deck crew and air crew. Trust that engines would hold at full throttle during takeoff. Trust that calculations made by pencil and stopwatch would bring them back to a carrier no wider than a city block in the middle of an ocean. That trust was forged in uncertainty. In the early months of World War II, the United States faced a confident and experienced adversary. Resources were limited. Outcomes were far from guaranteed. Each mission carried risk, not just to individual crews, but to the fleet as a whole. The aircraft did not win battles alone, but it allowed commanders to make informed decisions. It reduced uncertainty. It extended awareness. And in war, those advantages compound. As decades passed, the number of living veterans who had flown the aircraft dwindled. Oral history projects raced against time to capture their recollections. Recordings preserved the cadence of their voices as they described storm fronts over open water, the hum of engines during long patrols, the relief of spotting a carrier's wake after hours of searching. Their stories add texture to the aircraft's legacy. They speak not only of combat, but of boredom between contacts, of maintenance nights spent under dim lights, of letters written home from distant anchorages, of friendships that endured long after the war. The aircraft becomes, in these memories, more than hardware. It becomes a shared experience. Today, when a young visitor stands beneath one of the preserved examples and looks up at its wingspan, they may struggle to imagine a time when such a machine represented cutting-edge technology. They may see it as quaint compared to supersonic jets. But if they read carefully, if they paused before the photographs of carrier decks packed with aircraft during 1944, they might begin to understand. They might realize that before satellites and digital networks, before composite materials and stealth shaping, there were crews flying into vast uncertainty with nothing but maps, math, and determination. They might recognize that innovation often looks awkward at first, that breakthroughs are sometimes doubted before they are proven indispensable. And perhaps they will see a pattern that repeats across history. New technologies emerge, skeptics question them, conflict tests them, and if they succeed, they reshape doctrine permanently. The long-range carrier bomber followed exactly that arc. From controversy to necessity. From experimental concept to operational cornerstone. From frontline service to museum artifact. And yet, in a deeper sense, it has never fully left service. Its influence persists in every doctrine manual that emphasizes reconnaissance. In every naval exercise that stresses layered defense. In every carrier deployment that prioritizes extended situational awareness. The ocean remains vast. No technology has made it small. But the aircraft proved that distance could be managed, that horizons could be pushed outward, and that fleets need not sail blind. In the end, perhaps that is its greatest legacy. Not the bombs it dropped, not the ships it helped sink, but the knowledge it provided. Information, carried across miles of empty sky. As the sun sets over a museum ramp and the polished wings reflect warm light, the aircraft stands motionless, silent, retired. Yet its story continues, woven into the fabric of naval aviation, carried forward in every patrol that extends beyond sight of land. A machine once doubted became a symbol of transformation. And in that transformation, it helped shape the modern sea.